Thank you. So, yeah, thank you for inviting me here. This is a very strange talk in some ways because it's the first one I've ever done sitting down, but that's for the benefit of the microphone. And it's also the first one I've done on things which aren't my own research, because really everything I'm going to talk about tonight is nominations that have been put in by members of the public. So I have with me copious notes, which I may occasionally duck down to check, but I think really let's just get in. It'll be hopefully quite an interesting jaunt through Barnsley and a little bit of something for everyone. So a little bit about myself first. My name's James Thomson. I work for the South Yorkshire Archaeology Service. We are the archaeological advisors to the 4 local authorities in South Yorkshire. We're based in Sheffield, but our remit covers Barnsley, Rotherham, Doncaster and Sheffield. We largely provide planning advice, so if there's any archaeological issues we make sure that they're taken into consideration. But we also do other things which are more publicly orientated, like maintaining what we call the Historic Environment Record, which is a database of archaeological sites. And we also run the South Yorkshire Local Heritage List, which we've done so since 2021. And that has, it's not a full-time job. I do 1 day a week on this, but we'll go into what that is. So I'm going to talk about what the Local Heritage List is. We'll have this tour of Barnsley Local List, just a selection of the sites. And then we'll look at how to make a nomination and hopefully leave time at the end for questions and answers. So, Local Heritage Listing. So what is it? Well, as has been alluded to in the introduction, it's a list of heritage sites which aren't nationally listed. So things like listed buildings, scheduled monuments, those are things which are maintained at a national level. But the local list covers things which are more locally important, or regionally important really. So there's reasons why we do this. It helps members of the public get recognition for those sites and celebrates them. But the other part is it provides a robust process of assessment which allows planning authorities and those making decisions to have confidence that these things that are on the list really are of local importance. So when I talk about that, this idea of informing planning decisions, planning works in terms of weight. So the more weight you can attach to something, the more importance it has and the more consideration it's given in planning decisions. So we have a system in our list where we have a number of criteria, and we'll get into that towards the end. And the more criteria that we can tick off, then the more weight it gets. And if it can get 5 criteria ticked out of 7, then it gets it onto the local list. And that, we've found so far, really does make a difference when it comes to people making decisions in planning. Like, it gives it importance. It doesn't give it what is the next step, special weight, which is what you get if you get it onto national listing. But what we found is that some things that get locally listed are using that as a springboard. They've got all their information together, then they take it to Historic England and get it on the national list. And that's actually happened, I think, 2 or 3 times now. So, what does it cover? Well, it does cover buildings. They're the most obvious ones, and structures, but also places like Elsecar Reservoir, gardens, Dodworth Hall Park, archaeological sites, which can be both ruins or things entirely buried underground, and commemorative monuments. And the only one of those examples that isn't a Barnsley example is the commemorative monument. There are lots in Barnsley, but nobody has yet put them forward. So if anybody wants to do that, we can replace that picture of one in Doncaster with one in Barnsley. So far, we have got 337 assets on our list, which is great. It continues to grow every year. I think we're adding about 40, and that's 40? No, that's 40 per district. So that's our aim, and that's really the limit of the time that we've got to spend assessing these things. It could be higher, but it also relies on people making nominations. And you can see here what we've got in terms of a range. And how many we've got in Barnsley. So 46 in Barnsley out of 222 buildings. We've got parks and gardens, only 1 in Barnsley so far. Archaeological sites, it's pretty well represented in Barnsley. Areas and places, so there's 2, but no commemorative monuments yet. And we'll look at a few of these things now. So let's go on our jaunt. So I've themed it to try and provide a grouping to these things and try to create a through thread. We'll see how well that goes. So I wanted to start off with perhaps one of the less known industries that Barnsley is famous for, and that's linen weaving. From about the 1740s, when it was introduced into Barnsley by, I think it's Joseph Wilson. This is where I check my notes. John Wilson, William and John Wilson. So they set up a linen warehouse in Sheffield, and they outsourced linen weaving to people as a domestic industry. So here you can see what were the typical form of linen weaving houses in Barnsley, all demolished because of slum clearances. But in the basement there, you can see the slightly raised basement. That's where they did the weaving. And that's because linen weaving was best done in a slightly damp environment. It added strength to the fibres, the flax fibres, which they were weaving. So great for the weaving to have them in the basement. It's not so good for your health because these were dirt floors and they were probably down there for about 14 hours a day weaving. So that's one of the reasons why they no doubt got demolished. But if we have a look at the sort of things that still survive. So when it took off in Barnsley, it really took off, and there were people who owned rural farms. They actually converted farms to weaving sheds. So this one, at top row in Ardsley, and do correct me at the end if I pronounce any of the local names wrong. I'll do my best. And so here we have this one. It was built, we think, in the mid-18th century originally as a farm, converted around 1800 to be linen weaving, to have linen weaving cottages. Then there were several of them all divided up in a row. You can see in the building a partial arch on one of those elevations, and that's because it used to be a threshing barn. Part of that building was then demolished when the road was widened, and this is what's been left. But it's still got its cellar for the loom shop underneath. If we go to Dodworth Green, or Dodworth Green, sorry, there's my first slip up, there is another linen warehouse here, which was divided into linen weavers' cottages, but also has some agricultural buildings attached with cart sheds. And again, this one was from a similar date, and was operated by Edward Taylor, who was a Dodworth and Barnsley linen manufacturer. So we know some of the history from the person who's put in the nomination, that it was owned by Joseph Spate and occupied by Thomas Sunderland. But what's interesting here is that it's a very rural industry. Anyone who knows Dodworth Green knows that this really seems to be in the middle of nowhere, in terms of it hasn't got any major transport links. And this just shows you what people were doing. This was probably, for some people, a supplementary income. They worked on the land, and then when that wasn't happening, they worked on the looms. And they sold those bits that they made to up the chain. So it was a distributed production. That all changed when we got to the sort of the 1860s, because linen started to go out of fashion for starters, but also it became production in Barnsley came under competition from Scotland and Ireland. So one of the few sort of success stories of the transition to cotton for the local area was McClinnock's. I can't even pronounce it, but it's written there. and they built this weaving factory in Barnsley. It specialised in producing quilted materials, and you can see an excerpt from a catalogue there of the downs that they produced, but they were also known in the Second World War for producing the Victory Life Vest. And they survived right up until, I think, the 1970s. And so it shows you the sort of local entrepreneurship, because the person who founded this was originally the son of a hand loom weaver. So he managed to save, I think they said, 1 year's worth of profit from their business to build this, which and presumably added a lot of security to the people in the area who would have been put out of business working on the domestic scale. So the other industry, which is famous obviously for Barnsley district, is minerals. But I wanted to talk about a little bit other than coal. I thought we'd talk about ironstone mining. So these are two examples of, there's I think 3 or 4 of these sites now nominated in Barnsley, which is evidence of early mining. So there's one at Tankersley Golf Course, and you can just see that photo. Sorry it's a bit blurry because it was taken from a window passing on the M1. But it's these lumps and bumps, these circular lumps. And to the bottom there is Hugsett Wood, which is between Silkstone and Cawthorne. And the image on the left is the satellite view. The image on the right shows what is called which is LiDAR. That's light, distance and ranging. Essentially, it's a plane-borne sort of radar which maps the topography of the ground. So you can see within the woods all these little donut shapes, and those are the remains of mine shafts. But bell pits, as you perhaps might be familiar with the term, and these were small excavations dug down to whatever they were trying to get out, and then dug out as far as possibly safe from that one shaft usually without any propping, and then abandoned. And the fill from one, as it came out, went in to fill the other that had been abandoned. So you ended up with a heap above it, and as the heap compacted, you ended up with the shaft forming this donut. They're extensive throughout this area because certainly around Tankersley, every single wood you'll go into, you'll probably find rows of these things, which is thanks to the Fitzwilliams, who were very active in digging up the Tankersley Park and Garden that was, finding all the resources beneath it. And this just shows you the ironstone seam, the Tankersley seam that runs through Barnsley, and was the reason for this industry prior to coal, because they were digging out iron to provide the local iron industry. And this figure is actually, the map is actually pulled from one from the Hoyland Swain Nail Forge, which was one of the places where the iron was used, obviously, in making nails. So another industry, brickworks. Now this is near Cawthorne, and this is called the Brick House. Now I don't have a great deal that we actually know about the works itself. It makes plastic pipes now, but the nomination was put in principally for this building, and it is a showpiece of the materials that they were making at the brickworks. So whilst we don't necessarily have a great amount of history for the works, what we can see here is the products as a catalogue in physical form. And one of the things that's also interesting about this particular site is you can see that old Ordnance Survey map. It's got shafts marked on it. Now, they weren't excavating the clay. It doesn't appear so, that they were excavating all the clay from the surface. We think that they were probably actually excavating it as a underground quarry, or mining essentially. And the circular features in that map would have been the kilns, where after they'd prepped their bricks, dried them outside, they would stack them in there for firing. So it's the fact that this building still survives, whereas nothing else does, and it's quite isolated. It's a real nice little reminder, one that you might not obviously spot, but of brickworking industry in the region. So what links all this together, obviously, is transport. Now, we've got some early examples of that in Barnsley. So the wagonways, perhaps the main one here. I've got one in Elsica, which is quite short, but the big one is the one in Silkstone. And these worked, and if you go out and look at it today, you'll see these stone pads. And this reconstructed section in the photograph has it with these L-shaped iron bars running across the top of it. And these are the precursor to railways. And the illustration at the bottom is taken from a graphic for Thorncliffe Ironworks in Sheffield, but was the only one I instantly remembered that showed horses pulling carts, and that is an example of how materials were moved up and down this. So the Silkstone Wagonway was built from about 1800 to the 1830s in stages. It goes all the way from Barnsley Basin at the top there, for where the canal was, extending all the way down and linking a load of significant industrial sites. So you can see Low Mill Furnace there. That's a scheduled monument. That's a blast furnace. Actually, where the name Low Mill Furnace is going in that map overlies Hogsett Woods, which I showed you before, where all those mine shafts were. So there was a lot of industry going on around here, and this is obviously the Spencers hard at work, exploiting all the natural resources and employing all the labour in doing lots of steel making activities, really dispersed along a landscape. And this is what industry was like at the beginning of the 19th century, all these sites dispersed. And ultimately, by the 1830s and 40s and 50s, you start to get these all consolidated into integrated works where they no longer really do all the processing or the little stages spread out. You just get all your materials to one place and then deal with it all there. But this is a really interesting one and well worth a walk. And if you can get down to where it's Cross Colliery and the Cross, there's probably what is a little colliery tally office where there's a little window facing onto the wagonway, where no doubt they counted the wagons going past and doled out their fees. So that, as I said, joined at the top with Barnsley Basin, and that was part of the this collection of canals. So we have the Ayr and Calder Canal, which comes in from the north, and that's the one that's coming just out from the top photo there into Barnsley, and then the Dearne and Dove Canal constructed from the Don coming up to it, and then this stretch extending it from it to serve the Spencers' interests over in Cawthorne and Silkstone. And this nomination was for the remains of a lock. Now, quite an important one because it's unusual. It's a stop lock, so it's one of the ones that lies at the end of a canal, and it's designed to try and stop the water from getting into the other canal in this instance, because obviously if you want to control as much water as possible to maintain your levels. And this site that was nominated includes the lock, and inside the lock you can see in that photo bands of brick and stone going up the side. That's because it actually subsided, and they had to keep raising the walls to keep the water level in. There's also the remains of a lockkeeper's cottage there, and in the lock, that photo in the top right shows the bracket from the base of one of the canal doors. So there's still things in there relating to it, and so it's a nice survival for that part of that industrial story, large parts of that canal having been infilled. So moving on then, I don't know, this is a quick jaunt, so I'm hoping there'll be lots of questions at the end. We'll go to cooperative stores. Now, co-ops in Barnsley were a big deal. So they were formed from the original Rochdale pioneers. So they set up some of the perhaps the earliest successful form of cooperative store in the 1840s. And that, for those who don't know, the cooperative store, one of its main drivers was for working people to be able to have access to a shop and have interest in a shop that was separate from perhaps the owner of the works where they work. So quite early on, there would often be shops attached or ran by the people who were paying your wages. So they may have paid you in tokens which you could redeem in the shop, or they paid you in money but they set the prices in the shop. So yeah, this was felt to be a fairer way, obviously, of running a business. And the people who became members, any profit that came out from that store was then paid back to the members. So it was very successful. And this was I think started in Barnsley in the 1860s. This particular one in Bolton-upon-Dearne, and we had a nomination of several cooperative stores running through the eras. Of them, the earliest two got through. The more recent ones from the sort of second half of the 20th century were really heavily altered because they're ones which were designed to be alterable. They had open floors where you could move your display stands around and your shelves, and so the buildings themselves don't retain as much of their historic fabric. Whereas here, this one is particularly interesting because not only have we got the archive records which support it, but the building still today retains part of its Barnsley branch sign. And for those people unfamiliar with the way these stores were organised, you had at the front the store door, went in and it was all counter served behind. So the shopkeeper was behind his counter. And in fact, I suppose if you've seen, I've forgotten the name, Open All Hours, isn't it? Is it? No, I can't remember, the comedy. So at the back, there was the warehouse with a cart door leading, taking indoor, where you could raise things up and take them to the warehousing on the first floor. But attached to the side of it was the shopkeeper's house, so that they had quite good provisions. And that was still the same when this one was built in Hoyland in the 1920s. And you can see again, we've got good records. They kept good records, but the original design wasn't actually as built by the end. They actually went for something more elaborate. But this is within a more garden suburb style area of development, where we've got lots of semi-detached houses set out with gardens. And so they were obviously, when they were developing the design, they were looking for something which was slightly aspirational in terms of arts and crafts feel about it, but essentially operated in exactly the same way as the previous one. But what the reasons why these ones made it through is that they felt to have a good level of preservation of their character, and they really added to the sense of place in terms of this being the local store. You've got all the houses all around, and this forms a real nice focal point to the community in terms of this was where the co-op was. And so that social history added to the architectural history and really sort of deserves some recognition. And that's this is, local listings, as a process that can be picked up. So, country estates. So, here we have some elements of Stainborough Park. So, Wentworth Castle, the park and garden there is a Grade 1 registered park and garden. It's the only Grade 1 registered park and garden in South Yorkshire. It's very important design, developed by Thomas Wentworth in 1718 to 1730. And his son, who took over, added to, it was William Wentworth, added to the parks. And one of the things he built was to sort of elaborate on that ruined medieval character that Thomas had tried to establish, that kind of reaching back to give his estate a sense of history. And William built this row of ruined fortifications above Worsborough Common. Now, most of that is now gone. So this, I think, was the 1730s, but one small part still exists. And it's a significant, whilst hidden, relic of this designed landscape, and one that extends far outside of the actual registered park and garden. Similar features that exist for the Wentworth Woodhouse estate are listed, so it's quite a surprise that this one isn't. But it also perhaps just wasn't very well known. So this is probably one I see as being, one which will eventually make the step up to being nationally listed, because it's part of this larger, significant designed landscape. Then we've also got an example here of a villa built in Hood Green, so part of the estate village. Again, none of the old estate buildings outside of the park are protected nationally, and this is a well-preserved example of a 19th century estate cottage, and one in which actually had a post office attached to it and was designed to be part of the estate provision. There was another one which is very similar looking but didn't preserve quite so well, which was the schoolmaster's house, which hasn't been added to the list, but we tried to weigh up which are the ones are the best examples or survive well. Then we also have Dodderf Hall. And in terms of Dodderf Hall, now, the history of this as presented isn't actually, we don't actually know a great deal about it. It was, sorry, I've lost my page, but it was built, we believe that this hall was built originally in about the 1760s. It was then, certainly by 1800, it was occupied by the Thornley family, who also owned Dodderf Grange. And I can't say we've found anything out about where they got their money. So anyone who knows that, come talk to me afterwards and we can add that to the record. But what's interesting here is that this is a small, well, relatively small, but you can see, but quite grand country seat. The house itself was demolished. It went the way of many of these buildings, so that the Thornleys were occupying it up until, say, I think the early 1900s. By 1917, they weren't using it as their primary residence anymore, and they had given it to a charity for housing the wounded from the war. So it was used by invalided soldiers. Then we believe probably after the Second World War it was taken over by the Coal Board and then demolished. So the interest in this site there's numerous aspects. One is the fact that we've still got some of the agricultural buildings. So the bottom left is part of the estate farm, a threshing barn, really impressive one for the, you see the size of the door for going through. We've also got the gate lodge, which you can see reflected the architecture of the main house. Attached to this, the farmer's land still has all these standard planted trees and little clumps related to a design park and landscape. So this was actually, the listing for this is for the farm as one item, the lodge and the walls as another, and then the park as a third. And part of the interest of the park is that the house, whilst demolished, is very likely to also retain archaeological remains, because as with our experience in looking at these things, is that they demolished it and they probably just folded it all into the cellar. So there's no reason why they would have dug the cellars out, and no doubt they're still there, filled with the architectural remains of the building above. So as a potential flag on this site from the nomination, we now know that to look out for any future development proposals in that area. So it's very useful for that. So this is the last thing I'll talk about, is some civic and public buildings. Because these are more of your sort of ones which are the typical candidates for national listing. So often they fall down through national listing to us, I suspect, because of their condition. And this is perhaps one of those examples, the Salvation Army Citadel. So this was from 1895. The Salvation Army was formed in 1865 in London. And this, they formed themselves in sort of military terms. So they had ranks and they called their churches citadels, but they served a purpose in the community. And probably one of the things that attracted them to Barnsley was the disparity in wealth, and that there were people living rough and falling to drink and drugs, and that was one of the things that they targeted as a charitable aim. So this was not only their place where they held services, but also their base for administering care to people, those in need in the local community. And it's certainly, in terms of the building, it actually, whilst it looks shabby from the outside, the preservation on it is actually very good. It hasn't seen a great deal of change. So it's one of these buildings, whilst at risk, we feel needed and deserved the recognition that it's important and that it needs to be considered. There's actually an interesting building just next door to it, which is the old Stone Roses Bar. I should have had a photo in of that, but that's a cooperative warehouse, and that's also been locally listed. So then we've got a couple of things which are from the development of sort of municipal identity. So in Wombwell, this is the council offices built around the time that the Urban District Council was formed. And I'm going to check that date. 1860s? 1897, sorry. So, yeah, the Urban District Council was formed in 1894, and that was a government change in the way that local areas were divided and run. So they divided areas into urban districts and rural districts. And that gave local areas new powers, but also enabled them to sort of invest in their own municipal identity. So here we have a very grand building, and this one I've included because one of the interesting things we get through local listing is a bit of the social stories attached to these places, or rather sort of tangentially quite often, depending on the interests of the person putting the nomination in. So this one, the architect's John Robinson, and the application includes some interesting details about how he was connected to the Brontes through having been a apprentice to the schoolmaster who also was a relative of the Brontes. So he was apparently someone who, here it is. I was looking for the quote. I was stalling. Sorry, it was probably very obvious. Mr. Robinson was born in Harworth near Keighley, the village now world famous as the home of the Brontes. He was sent to Harworth National School. He was, at the age of 13, apprenticed as pupil teacher at the school, the managers of which was the Reverend Patrick Bronte, father of the famous sisters, and he seems to have fallen in with the family because he was one of the few people invited to the early morning wedding of the famous writer. So it's one of those things you go, well, the architect has this other strand of interest which has somehow now been attached by local stories to the building itself. So these things are often more than their bricks and mortar, they're the stories attached to them, which is, we like to get that captured, but when people were able to provide them. Then the other example I've got is the Carnegie Library in Bolton-upon-Doon. So this is also actually a council office and library, no longer in use. And this is one of those urban districts, which is unusual because it was actually originally part of Doncaster Rural District and then became its own urban district in, I think, 1890s. And they set upon quite quickly wanting to build a library and council offices. Obviously, you can see their development of their own municipal identity compared to the last one. They're quite similar in age, but they've gone for red brick and less Gothic in its design. And what's interesting is that they also managed to secure the Carnegie funding to build a library. So Andrew Carnegie was an industrialist living in America, but originally from Scotland. And he funded about, well, in the UK, about 600 libraries. Of those, there are about 6, I think, in South Yorkshire, and 3 of those are in Barnsley. And in order to secure the funding, you had to demonstrate that there was a local need. And what is interesting for Barnsley was that from the 1850s, there was a educational report identifying that because of the coal mining industry, there was actually a very big educational gap between those between different statuses. So the coal miners, having been apprentices or going into coal mining from quite an early age, didn't get education. So perhaps one way of providing education was through making free libraries, which allowed anyone to go in, from children to adults, to borrow books, to read them and to self-educate. So libraries were a very important tool in industrial communities. Prior to the Carnegie free libraries, there was quite often libraries were by subscription, and you paid to borrow a book, which obviously ruled out suddenly children from having one who'd have no access to money, and probably the poorer families too. So the other thing that's interesting about Bolton-upon-Doon is that as an urban district, it only lasted about 30 years before it became part of Barnsley. So it was quite a short-lived period in which it was its own municipality, and this is a relic of that. So moving on through education, I thought we'd have a look at the Barnsley Mining and Technical College. So this obviously is right next door, designed by the same architect as the building that we're sat in. Built in 1932. It was a long time coming, let's say, because from this report in 1850 that I mentioned, which identified an urgent need to foster and establish mining institutes to find a solution to the unique problems arising from the mining of coal. It wasn't until 1911 that funding started to become available to build these sorts of buildings. And then this one, obviously, was then delayed by the First World War, delayed by the Depression, and then finally came in the 1930s. But it's at that point, it probably came in quite a pivotal point, because from the 1930s we're getting a lot more technological advancement in mining, and having education available for people to actually learn how to work a modern mine was essential, and provided Barnsley with the skills that it needed to compete with the other coal fields. But it wasn't just coal, of course, because you can see there in the top left there's a picture of them teaching about how to cut joints of meat. So it was other skills. And prior to this, these were being taught, these lessons were being taught, but they didn't have a dedicated building. They were dispersed around Barnsley in halls and available spaces where they were rented by the council in order to provide short-term education. So this was a major investment, and it's an absolutely stonking building right there. Really has a real sense of place, and is again one which I suspect really has, add me onto the national list written all over it. So that's my whiz through Barnsley's local list, and that is really only a snapshot. There's a lot more there, and I would really encourage people, if they do nothing else after this, to log onto the website and scroll around and look at things. And the list gets updated when we go through the assessment, and I'll talk about that. But so you'll expect to see new things added several times a year as we get through that. So the ways to get involved in this. There's a dedicated website. There's leaflets at the back that you can take away, which is already written down on. But if you just Google South Yorkshire Local Heritage List, you'll get that link to that page. There's a map there where you can scroll around, zoom in and out, and click on assets and link through to detailed pages which contain the history that's been provided. I very periodically add a blog post, and that's mainly just to say when new things are going out for consultation, and so that you can see what's coming through. There's how-to guides about how to make submissions, and that leads through to this online form for doing that. So how do you make a nomination? Well, the first obvious thing is to find a site, find something that you think is important. And really, I've put there, is it something you already know or have connections with? That's the obvious in, because that probably means that you know more about it than, say, anyone from outside the county already. Probably, certainly more than me. But it doesn't have to be. It could see some of the things that we get through. We hear people just pick them because they drive past it every day, or they have a real interest in milestones, and so they're going around and finding them and wanting to pad them on, and anything's valid as a suggestion. So have a look. The next thing to do really is to check to see if it's already been designated, and our website has national listings on it, so you can check to see if it's already been added to the national list, or if somebody's already put it forward for local listing, so that you don't duplicate. But if you accidentally do, that's not a problem, because we check in with people and then merge their nominations. And then you can look at the existing ones to see what information is in there, and you get an idea for what level of detail you might need to go into. And then the final stage is actually to click the Nominate a Heritage Asset button, and then it provides you instructions of where you go stage by stage. The how-to guides, if you're stuck, are really helpful because they're something you can print out and have to hand. And those tell you how to go about filling things out, but they also have a few other things for those of people who are really coming at it new in terms of how to do research or how to take photographs, because taking photographs isn't always as easy as like to get good ones for a record. We will encourage people to take their time and frame the shots and find the details, because when it comes to assessing these, we do it from remotely. We don't go out and look at every single one because we'd never get through any that way. So we rely on the information provided to us. So having good information, good photos is always really useful. But again, sometimes we get nominations with no photos, and we do have to go out and take photos of them. So if transport and getting around is a problem for you, don't worry about that. Just put it in. More important. So I said about criteria. I'm not expecting everyone to read this slide. There's a lot of text on this slide, but I'm not sure whether this will get circulated afterwards, and I thought better to put it on than not. So we have these 7 criteria that we use, and these are developed from advice from Historic England, and they used to be English Heritage, those who don't know, and they obviously provide the national list. And so we use their guidance because it gives us a good, robust baseline, allows us to provide that confidence that we're following the best standards. So the criteria here are age, which obviously is an obvious one. There's a traditional cut-off in national listing that if it dates to after 1840, then it's a harder sell to get it listed. The local list, we're a bit more flexible. We say 1840 because that's an automatic tick for us, because it says it's sufficiently old to qualify for age. If it's after that, we usually look to see, well, is it fitting into some sort of local movement or significant community, or what's change or industry or emerging municipal identities, that sort of thing. Rarity, just, obviously having a semi-detached house from the 1950s may not make it onto the list, but say that whole estate was the first council estate built by Barnsley, and shows some real innovation in the way they were trying to provide social housing, then that might then be rare. So, it's all about scale sometimes. And then obviously architectural and artistic interest, just, do we know the architect? Is it well designed? Does it feature in a lot of art, local art? Archaeological interest, what would you get if you went in to research that thing from the structure itself? So what are the stories that are embodied in it? And the evidence that if we went and looked at, if we studied it, what would we add to understanding of its architectural, historic interest and all that other thing? It's sort of like the research potential, not just what's buried beneath it, but sometimes actually what's in the building itself. Historic interest, what are the stories, the community interest we can attach to this? Who are the people who are involved in its story? The landmark status. Is it something that really makes an important contribution to the corner of a junction? Is it something that is purposefully designed to catch your eye? All of this sort of thing counts for that. And then group value. So not just a group in terms of what's next door to it, although that's important. But does it have a group with other things nearby? Was it one of 5 cooperative stores built in the 1860s, which would then say, well, that's, that is an important group because it's the early development of the Barnsley British Cooperative Society. And that adds to their value. They can collectively elevate each other. And that's the general criteria. To help people, we actually, if you go onto the website, for any one of the categories, if it's a building or a garden, an archaeological site, we've refined that to say, well, if you're talking about a building, can you say it's definitely dates before 1840, or can you say that it's linked to a municipal identity, or whatever, so that we can kind of help you understand at each stage what the information is that we're looking for. Oh, I've talked about this. I forgot that I had some slides that had some pictures. So, you know, here we go. You can see an 1850 map and a building on it. I'm afraid these aren't Barnsley examples. I'm sorry about that. But they are South Yorkshire at least. Are they rare or unusual? History and certainly if there's historic features still in situ, like signs painted on the wall for air raid shelter, that really tells a story. Or the actual plant from the manufacturing equipment inside. Landmark status, those big buildings on corners. The architecture, not just architect designed, but those ones which are built in the local style. They're really important. So finding those, even where they've had changes made, like perhaps plastic windows put in, that doesn't necessarily exclude them. It's more about how they're overall. I've put this question mark next to some airy houses, which are concrete framed houses, because these require greater justification, but they may be, it doesn't necessarily rule them out for local listing. They can be heritage assets, because things like this, we haven't had a local list application for concrete houses yet. There are some early prefab houses that have been added, but these ones just happen to be to hand because they're recently in Sheffield, where they built a lot of these in the 1960s to replace slum housing and to catch up on the gap after the war. They were going through and replacing all the concrete with brick. And there was a question raised by some members of the public, like, are we actually losing some character here? Because there's a history to these and a story to be told. And so they were actually identified collectively as a heritage asset, so something that has value to to history, even though they're from the 1860s. So that was taken into consideration. Obviously, the issue here was that they're falling apart, so there was no way you could necessarily enforce preservation. But they did mean that they got considered and recorded. And we had people go around and take photos of the properties to try and capture this for future researchers when they come back and they want to know, well, where was it my nana lived? And this, you know, what was it like after she moved out of that back to back? Well, she moved into one of these with its separate bathrooms, a separate bathroom and multiple bedrooms. So, and then archaeology, and this can be a challenging one, but if anybody's interested in that, then please get in touch with us at the South Yorkshire Archaeology Service, because we have a lot of information and we would love people to put more archaeological sites in. So it's also something that's always worth checking with us if you are doing research, because of this historic environment record that we maintain. We may be able to tell you that there are things linked to that site or beneath that site which might be of interest. So anything really on terms of the things that we've had nominated are ruins such as the tin mill in Wortley, and to below ground remains like Romano-British settlements, which you can't see as you drive past, but somebody knows they're there and they've put them forward. So there are some great sites there, but again, if you have anything that you want to ask us about because you're interested in getting into that, then you can get in touch. Keeping my eye on time, I'll just quickly run through this last one. This slide is just to show you the process, really. So when somebody puts a nomination into us, we check it, we review it, we look at additional information we've got, and we will add to it or work with the person who put the nomination in to add information to it, depending on what they want to do. So, because we know that some people find it hard to tick all the boxes, and so they can check with us. And these days, when we first started, we didn't really have the time to go through, and we still don't have the time, I've said this to someone already, we still don't have the time to go through and add to all of them. But what we've identified is that it's time well spent, because when people put something in, and if they've had a challenge getting the information together, because we're more experienced in having done research and we've got resources available to us, that we can actually go through and say, well, actually, we think it's worth adding this, this and this, and do you want us to put that in? And people say yes, and then that helps give it a leg up when it comes to the assessment. Then we batch all those nominations together, and about 3 or 4 times a year we run through those with a panel of local heritage experts, including people from the Civic Trust and the Conservation Officer, other people from local amenity groups, anyone who can prove to us that they've got experience and knowledge, specialist knowledge in a particular field, then we may draw on them to come and help us assess particular assets, because part of that is that it's local knowledge which really helps us understand what's significant. Then after that, anything that gets recommended goes to the owners for consultation to check if they've got any information they want to give us. We don't bring them into the consultation early, because if it doesn't get through the process or it gets stalled for whatever reason, then we don't want to make people worried, because one of the things that local heritage listing does sometimes cause is people worry that they're going to stop being able to live, use the house, or it opens the doors to members of the public. It doesn't do any of those things, but we have that conversation with them at this point to say it's not a bad thing, it's not going to affect you unless you want to demolish the building, in which case we would be onto it anyway. So there is no change to the people who own these things in terms of what they can do at this point. So then the final recommendations are then passed to the local council, who then formally adopt it. So in Barnsley, we send them off and they're very quick to turn that around, and so these things get added to the list quite quickly in Barnsley. But final slide, I've just put up some useful links there to different places where you can find information. I've included not just Barnsley archive sources, just in case there's people here from outside the region, but again, I would just reiterate, if you have any interest in local listing, then please grab a flyer, have a look at the website, drop us an email. I'm happy to answer questions and help you find sites or find information for sites that you know about. Thank you.